On July 5th, 2025, Ozzy Osbourne stepped onto a stage for what he knew might be the last time. At 76 years old, the man the world called the Prince of Darkness was no longer the wild figure who once commanded arenas with a scream. Instead, he walked slowly, leaning on a cane with Sharon Osbourne at his side. Over 40,000 fans packed into Birmingham, his birthplace, while nearly 6 million watched online. This wasn't just another performance, it was a farewell wrapped in gratitude. He greeted the crowd with a voice that cracked under age and illness, yet every word landed heavy with meaning. "This may well be the last time I ever stand on a stage," he said, not as a lament, but as a truth he had accepted. The atmosphere shifted. This was no longer a concert, it was history. Behind the emotion was a deeper story. Ozzy's health had been in steep decline for years due to Parkinson's disease, a 2019 fall that worsened his spine injuries from a 2003 quad bike crash, and a relentless cycle of surgeries. By 2025, walking even short distances required effort. His hands shook, his balance faltered, and his voice had lost the raw power that once shook stadium walls. But he refused to let frailty define his last chapter. That night in Birmingham, every song felt like a memory come alive. The opening riffs of Paranoid brought the crowd to tears, while War Pigs carried a weight beyond its lyrics, a reminder of the fire that had driven him for decades. And when the final notes faded, the applause wasn't just for the performance, it was for the lifetime behind it. Here's where his final act became even more powerful. Every dollar earned from that concert, a staggering $190 million, went to causes close to his heart. The money was split among Parkinson's Research, Birmingham Children's Hospital, and Acorn Children's Hospice. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a parting gift from a man who had known suffering, loss, and the value of fighting for something beyond himself. In the weeks that followed, Ozzy stayed largely out of the public eye, spending his days at home in Buckinghamshire. Railings lined the halls, ramps replaced stairs. Every part of the house adapted to his declining mobility. But there were still moments when he would sit in his garden, headphones on, letting old riffs wash over him. Sometimes he would step into his home studio, not to record for an album, but simply to remember who he had been when the music was all that mattered. It was here, in these quiet moments, that the legend began to close his final chapter. Surrounded by Sharon, his children, and grandchildren, Ozzy Osbourne prepared for the inevitable, not with fear, but with acceptance. The man who had spent decades screaming into the chaos was now at peace in the silence. And just 17 days after that final Birmingham show, on July 22nd, 2025, the world said goodbye. The battle with Parkinson's and declining health. By the time Ozzy Osbourne walked onto that Birmingham stage in July 2025, his fight against Parkinson's disease had already consumed years of his life. He was first diagnosed in 2019, but the seeds of his health struggles had been planted much earlier. The diagnosis didn't come with a sudden crash, it arrived like a slow, relentless tide. At first it was subtle, a tremor in the hand, a stumble on stage, an occasional slur in his speech. But as months turned into years, the symptoms became impossible to ignore. The turning point came in early 2019, when Ozzy suffered a fall at home. It seemed minor at first, but it dislodged metal rods that had been fused into his spine after his near-fatal quad bike accident in 2003. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. He later described it as beyond anything I've ever felt. Multiple surgeries followed, each one more draining than the last, and the recovery was brutally slow. What had once been a body built for the chaos of touring now struggled to walk unassisted. But Ozzy was not one to vanish quietly. In January 2020, he went public with his Parkinson's diagnosis, speaking with unfiltered honesty about the challenges ahead. "I can't walk properly these days, I'm just wobbling," he admitted. His fans didn't turn away. Instead, they rallied around him. That year, he released Ordinary Man, an album steeped in reflection and defiance. It wasn't about chart success, it was about proving he still had something to say, even as his body betrayed him. As the years passed, the disease continued its quiet assault. Ozzy's days became carefully structured, physical therapy to maintain what strength he could, a strict schedule of medication, and the support of round-the-clock care. Sharon was there for every appointment, every difficult night, every small victory. Their home became both a sanctuary and a battleground, where each day was measured not in big moments, but in the ability to stand, walk, or enjoy a pain-free afternoon. There were moments when it seemed the music was gone for good. Cancelled tours, postponed shows, and long stretches out of the public eye sparked speculation that his performing days were over. Yet every time doubt surrounded him, Ozzy found a way to rise, whether it was recording new music, making appearances on the Osbournes' podcast, or surprising fans with guest performances. By 2024, it was clear that his health was in irreversible decline. Still, he decided on one last stand, a final performance in his hometown, where the legend began. It would be a farewell not marked by sadness, but by gratitude. This decision wasn't made on a whim. It was the result of months of preparation, rehab sessions, and the determination to control his own ending on the stage. When he finally stepped out in July 2025, cane in hand, Parkinson's didn't disappear. It was there in his shaking hands, in the pauses between breaths, but it no longer defined him. For those few hours under the lights, he was simply Ozzy Osbourne, the man who had fought, fallen, and fought again. The 2019 fall and the 2003 quad bike accident. The decline that defined Ozzy Osbourne's final years can be traced back to two devastating accidents, separated by more than a decade, yet forever linked in how they shaped his body and his life. The most recent blow came in early 2019. At home in Los Angeles, Ozzy took what seemed like an ordinary fall, but for him, nothing about it was ordinary. The impact dislodged metal rods that had been surgically placed in his spine after an earlier accident. These rods had been there since 2003, fused into his vertebrae after a near-fatal crash. Now the fall ripped them loose, triggering excruciating pain and requiring immediate surgery. Ozzy later admitted it was the most intense pain he had ever endured, an astonishing statement from a man who had lived through decades of physical punishment. The surgeries that followed were long and complicated. Recovery was slow and filled with setbacks, simple movements became ordeals, and the idea of returning to the stage seemed impossible. This was the moment when Parkinson's symptoms began to show more clearly. The fall hadn't caused the disease, but it had magnified every weakness, accelerating the decline. To understand why the 2019 fall was so catastrophic, you have to go back to December 8, 2003. At his Buckinghamshire estate, Ozzy was riding a quad bike across his property. It was a casual ride, something he'd done countless times before. But that day, the vehicle flipped, crushing him beneath its weight. The injuries were severe: shattered collarbone, multiple broken ribs, a crushed vertebra in his neck, and collapsed lungs. He stopped breathing. For 8 days, he lay in a coma, kept alive by machines. Sharon later recalled, "I thought I was going to lose him. I was bracing for goodbye." The crash was a shock not only to his family, but to fans worldwide. When Ozzy eventually woke, doctors warned it could be months or even years before he would walk again. But true to his history, he refused to stay down. Through painful rehab, he regained mobility and returned to public life within months, an almost impossible recovery. Still, the 2003 accident left a permanent mark. Chronic pain became a constant, and the metal supports in his spine, meant to stabilise him, were always a reminder of how fragile his body had become. For years, he carried on, performing, touring, and even starring in the family's hit reality TV show, The Osbournes. But that old injury was a ticking clock, and in 2019, time ran out. That fall at home wasn't just a setback, it was the beginning of the end of his ability to perform at the level he once had. The surgeries that followed left him more dependent on canes, wheelchairs, and careful planning. Yet, even in pain, he refused to disappear, showing up for fans whenever possible and continuing to record music. These two accidents, 2003 and 2019, were more than physical injuries. They were turning points, forcing Ozzy to confront his own mortality long before his final days. And in both cases, his survival wasn't just luck. It was the result of a stubborn will that had carried him through every stage of his life. The Osbournes era and reinvention in the 2000s, before illness and accidents began to slow him down, Ozzy Osbourne experienced an unexpected career rebirth in the early 2000s, one that had nothing to do with heavy metal riffs or pyrotechnics. In March 2002, the Osbournes premiered on MTV, offering the world a raw, unscripted look at life inside the Osbourne household. Fans expecting the dark, intimidating Prince of Darkness persona were instead met with a sometimes confused, foul-mouthed but deeply lovable father, shuffling around his home in slippers. This was a cultural shift for Ozzy. For decades, he had been seen as a wild, chaotic frontman, someone who bit the head off a bat on stage and roared through the 1970s and 80s with reckless abandon. Now, audiences saw him in a different light, struggling with the TV remote, yelling at the family dogs, and trying to keep up with the antics of Sharon, Kelly, and Jack. The show became a surprise phenomenon, drawing millions of viewers each week and winning an Emmy Award. While the series gave Ozzy mainstream exposure unlike anything he'd had before, it also revealed the toll years of performing and substance abuse had taken. His speech was slower, his movements less steady, and his energy visibly lower. At the time, many viewers thought it was simply the result of his past excesses, but in retrospect, these may have been early signs of the neurological challenges that would later be diagnosed as Parkinson's disease. During this period, Ozzy also continued to record and tour, proving he was still more than a reality TV star. Albums like Down to Earth, 2001, and Black Rain, 2007, kept him connected to his core fan base, while his appearance at Ozzfest, an annual music festival founded by Sharon, cemented his role as a godfather of metal for a new generation. Then came the December 2003 quad bike accident, which threatened to bring everything to a halt. The crash left him in critical condition, and production on the Osbournes was put on hold. The nation watched as Sharon provided updates from the hospital, and fans sent thousands of messages of support. Miraculously, within months, Ozzy was back on his feet and even returned to filming. His recovery became part of his legend, a reminder that this was a man who had already cheated death more than once. By the late 2000s, Ozzy had transitioned into a new phase of his career. He had gone from heavy metal anti-hero to mainstream pop culture icon, appearing in commercials, voicing animated characters, and guest starring on talk shows. But behind the public appearances, the effects of his injuries and years of physical strain were starting to accumulate. He still toured, but his schedule was more selective. He still recorded, but the process required more rest. The world saw the humour and charm, but Ozzy knew his body was beginning to betray him. This was the paradox of the 2000s for Ozzy Osbourne. He was more famous than ever, with a broader audience and a revived career, yet the same era was setting the stage for the battles that would dominate his final decades. And as history would show, every high point in Ozzy's life seemed to be followed by a storm. The 1980s collapse, Randy Rhoads' death, and the fight for survival. The 1980s should have been the triumphant start of Ozzy Osbourne's solo career. After being fired from Black Sabbath in 1979, he had found new purpose alongside rising guitar prodigy Randy Rhoads. Their 1980 debut Blizzard of Oz and the follow-up Diary of a Madman in 1981 reintroduced Ozzy to the world as more than a cast-off frontman. He was a reborn force in rock, raw and unpredictable, yet revitalized. But then, in March 1982, the unthinkable happened. While on tour in Leesburg, Florida, the band stopped at a property owned by their bus driver. A small private plane was sitting on the grounds, and the driver, a licensed pilot, decided to take it for a spin. Randy, along with makeup artist Rachel Youngblood, joined for what was supposed to be a quick thrill. On the third pass over the tour bus, the plane's wing clipped the vehicle, sending it spiralling into a fireball. Randy was killed instantly at just 25 years old. Ozzy watched the crash from the ground. He ran toward the wreckage, screaming Randy's name, but the flames were unrelenting. Later, he said, "It wasn't just Randy's body in that fire, it was my hope, my music, my reason to keep breathing." The loss plunged him into a darkness deeper than any he'd known before. Shows were cancelled, and for weeks he barely spoke. The man who had just been pulled out of one career death spiral now faced another, this time fueled by grief rather than rejection. In the months and years that followed, Ozzy's self-destruction accelerated. Alcohol and drugs became his way of numbing the pain, but they also chipped away at his relationships, his health, and his ability to perform. Sharon, who had helped him rebuild after Sabbath, refused to give up on him. She became both his manager and his lifeline, holding the pieces together even when he couldn't. By the late 1980s, the situation hit a breaking point. In August 1989, during a blackout he would later describe as being outside himself, Ozzy came dangerously close to harming Sharon. The incident led to his arrest and an immediate stint in a psychiatric facility. For the first time, there were no instruments, no crowds, just silence and the stark reality of the man he had become. This was where a turning point began to form. The rehab process was brutal, confronting years of addiction, guilt, and unresolved trauma. Ozzy later admitted that what scared him most wasn't losing fame, it was losing Sharon for good. She chose to stand by him, telling him, "You are still in there, I know it." That belief gave him the strength to start clawing his way back. By 1991, Ozzy released No More Tears, an album that blended commercial success with personal redemption. Songs like Mama, I'm Coming Home felt more intimate than anything he'd done before, hinting at the battles he was fighting off stage. The comeback wasn't clean, relapses and personal struggles continued, but it marked the beginning of a long, stubborn journey towards stability. The 1980s left permanent scars on Ozzy, both emotionally and physically, but they also built the resilience that would define him in the decades to come. That same refusal to quit, born from tragedy, would one day carry him through injuries, illness, and the final years of his career. Black Sabbath's rise and the 1979 firing. Before the solo albums, before reality television, before decades of public battles with health and addiction, Ozzy Osbourne was simply the voice of a new and unsettling sound in rock music. In 1968, a modest newspaper ad seeking a vocalist brought him into a rundown rehearsal space in Birmingham, where he met Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler and Bill Ward. At first, they called themselves Earth, but a chance sighting of a horror film poster titled Black Sabbath inspired a new name and a new mission. If people paid to be scared in movies, why not in music? That was Ozzy's thinking, and with Iommi's heavy riffs, Butler's brooding bass lines, and Ward's thunderous drumming, the band found a sound that was darker, heavier, and more ominous than anything on the radio. Their debut album, Black Sabbath, released on Friday, February 13th, 1970, was met with critical disdain. Critics called it satanic, unpleasant, even unlistenable. But the youth, the disaffected, the outsiders, connected instantly. Later that same year, Paranoid exploded onto the charts almost by accident, containing songs like War Pigs, Iron Man, and the title track. These weren't just songs, they were statements of rebellion and alienation. Ozzy's voice wasn't technically refined, but it was raw, urgent, and utterly distinct. Fans felt as if he was screaming their own frustrations back at them. It was heavy metal's birth cry, and Ozzy was its most recognisable voice. Through the early and mid-1970s, Black Sabbath became one of the most influential rock bands in the world. Albums like Master of Reality, 1971, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, 1973, and Sabotage, 1975, cemented their legacy. But behind the scenes, the constant grind of touring, creative tensions, and heavy drug and alcohol use were eroding the band's cohesion. Ozzy, already battling personal demons, began missing rehearsals, slurring through sessions, and clashing with Iommi. By 1979, the situation reached its breaking point. The band, exhausted by his unpredictable behaviour, made the decision to fire him. In what would later feel like a betrayal that never fully healed, they didn't even tell him directly. Someone else was sent to deliver the news. For Ozzy, it wasn't just the loss of a job, it was the destruction of the one place where his chaos had been turned into something powerful. In his own words, that was my band. It wasn't just music, it was my life. Without Black Sabbath, he retreated to a Los Angeles hotel room, curtains drawn, drowning himself in drugs and alcohol. Days blurred into nights, and for a time, he believed this was where his story would end. But as history would prove, Ozzy's career wasn't over. It was only changing form. In his lowest moments, Sharon Osbourne, daughter of Black Sabbath's former manager, saw something worth saving. She convinced him he could make music without his old bandmates, introducing him to guitarist Randy Rhoads and sparking a creative rebirth that would eventually become the Blizzard of Oz. Still, the firing left an emotional scar that never truly faded. It was the first major fracture in his professional life, and it taught him that even the highest peaks could collapse without warning, a lesson that would echo throughout the rest of his career. Troubled childhood and early life. Long before Ozzy Osbourne became the voice of heavy metal, he was John Michael Osbourne, born December 3rd, 1948, in the industrial heart of Aston, Birmingham, England. He grew up in a cramped two-bedroom home with 6 children and 2 exhausted parents. His father, Jack, worked long hours in a factory, and his mother, Lillian, spent her days on the assembly line. Love was scarce, and tenderness was rarer still. From the start, life dealt him a difficult hand. Ozzy struggled with dyslexia, a condition barely understood in the 1950s. Reading and writing were nearly impossible, and teachers dismissed him as hopeless. The classroom wasn't just unkind, it was brutal. Classmates mocked him relentlessly, and the bullying often turned physical. Fists in the hallway, knees to the stomach, bloodied lips. These weren't occasional incidents. They were part of his daily routine. Home offered no safe haven. One day, after returning in tears from school, his father beat him with a belt, not for getting hurt, but for showing weakness. "Pain didn't get you sympathy," Ozzy would later say. "It got you punishment." This hardened him, but also buried his emotions deeper, creating a silence he carried for years. By age 14, that silence had turned into something darker. Feeling invisible, worthless, and without purpose, he reached a breaking point. In a tiny bedroom, he tied a rope made from his mother's washing line and climbed onto a chair, ready to end it. Fate intervened in the form of rage. His father walked in, yanked him down, and beat him again. It was a moment that didn't heal him, but instead hardened a part of him forever. After that, he stopped trying in school, speaking only when necessary. By 15, he had dropped out entirely, drifting through menial jobs, slaughterhouse worker, construction labourer, car horn tuner, but nothing lasted. His attention wandered, his work suffered, and employers quickly let him go. By 17, hunger wasn't just emotional, it was physical. His shoes had holes, his clothes were threadbare, and his hope was nearly gone. Desperation pushed him toward crime. In 1965, he was caught attempting a burglary and sentenced to 6 weeks in Winson Green Prison. Inside, the reality hit hard. Hostile inmates, constant tension, and the fight for survival. In one altercation, he defended himself with a metal chamber pot, an act born not from courage but necessity. Yet even in that darkness, a spark survived. One afternoon, the Beatles' She Loves You played on a prison radio. The sound cracked something open in him. For the first time, he didn't want to fade away. He wanted to be heard. He didn't know how to play an instrument or sing professionally, but he knew he needed to try. That moment became a vow. He would not die forgotten in Birmingham. When he walked out of prison at 17, he was still fractured, still poor, but now he had something new, a reason to push forward. That spark of purpose, born in the lowest place imaginable, would carry him into the music that would define his life. When Ozzy Osbourne walked out of Winson Green Prison in 1965, he didn't emerge with a clear plan. He was 17, broke, and still carrying the weight of a childhood steeped in poverty and abuse. But he carried something else too, a fire lit by the sound of the Beatles' She Loves You echoing off the prison walls. For the first time in his life, he wanted to be seen, to be heard, to matter. He had no formal training. He couldn't read music, but Ozzy's drive wasn't built on skill, it was built on survival. He began hanging around Birmingham's local music scene, watching pub bands, absorbing the energy of live performance. He worked odd jobs, sold stolen amplifiers, and even pawned a stolen TV to scrape together the money for a small PA system and microphone. It was the first real investment in himself he had ever made. In 1967, he joined a local band called Rare Breed, fronted by his friend Geezer Butler. The group didn't last long, but it was enough to give Ozzy a taste of fronting a band. After Rare Breed fell apart, Ozzy and Geezer decided to stick together, forming another band, Earth, with guitarist Tony Iommi and drummer Bill Ward. But fate was about to shape their identity in an unexpected way. One day, the band noticed a cinema marquee advertising a Boris Karloff horror film titled Black Sabbath. Geezer remarked that people paid to be scared, so why not make music that gave them that same thrill? The name stuck, and so did the shift toward a darker, heavier sound. In rehearsal rooms thick with cigarette smoke and distortion, the band began experimenting with slower tempos, ominous lyrics, and power chords that rang like church bells from hell. Ozzy's voice wasn't refined, but it cut through the gloom like a siren, high, haunting, and unforgettable. By 1969, Black Sabbath was playing clubs across England, developing a loyal following among young people who felt alienated by the peace and love optimism of mainstream rock. Their sound was raw, their image unpolished, but they had something no other band did, the sense that they were pulling music from the shadows, not the sunshine. When they stepped into the studio to record their self-titled debut in late 1969, they didn't realise they were laying the groundwork for an entirely new genre. The album, released in February 1970 on the unluckiest date imaginable, Friday the 13th, would split critics but ignite a cultural movement. Heavy metal was being born, and Ozzy's wail was its first cry. That leap from the working-class streets of Aston to the emerging global stage didn't erase the struggles Ozzy had endured. If anything, it magnified them. But it also proved the vow he'd made in prison was real. He would not fade away. The boy who had once been invisible was now the frontman of a sound loud enough to shake the world. The peak years of Black Sabbath. By the early 1970s, Black Sabbath had gone from an underground curiosity to one of the most talked about bands in rock. Their sound, built on Tony Iommi's down-tuned riffs, Geezer Butler's ominous bass, Bill Ward's pounding drums, and Ozzy Osbourne's haunting vocals, was unlike anything the world had heard. Their music didn't offer escapism. It confronted listeners with the shadows they already felt lurking in their lives. 1970 was the year everything changed. Their debut album Black Sabbath hit in February, and by September they had released Paranoid. Songs like War Pigs, Iron Man, and the title track became anthems for those who felt disconnected from the polished optimism of mainstream rock. Critics largely hated it, accusing them of promoting darkness and even Satanism. But to the youth, the music wasn't about worshipping evil, it was about speaking truths no one else wanted to hear. In 1971, they released Master of Reality, doubling down on slower, heavier riffs and deeper themes. It was around this time that the band's influence began spreading internationally, with tours across the United States and Europe. Their shows were loud, chaotic, and unlike anything concertgoers had seen. Smoke machines, ominous stage lighting, and Ozzy's frantic energy made each performance a ritual as much as a concert. But fame brought its own poison. By the mid-1970s, the band's schedule was punishing. Endless tours, press obligations, and the constant pressure to deliver new albums. Ozzy, already predisposed to excess, began drinking and using drugs heavily. At first, it seemed part of the rock lifestyle, but soon it started to bleed into rehearsals and recording sessions. Albums like Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, 1973, and Sabotage, 1975, kept the band's profile high, but behind the scenes, tension was mounting. Creative disagreements flared. Geezer's lyrics grew more complex. Tony pushed for more experimental sounds, and Ozzy, increasingly detached, preferred the raw heaviness of their early work. Add to this the haze of substance abuse, and communication within the band began to fracture. By the time they recorded Never Say Die in 1978, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Ozzy was missing rehearsals, sometimes vanishing for days. The sessions were strained, and the resulting album lacked the cohesion of their earlier work. The band still had a loyal following, but internally, it felt like they were running on fumes. The breaking point came in 1979. Ozzy was fired from the band, a decision he would later describe as devastating, not just professionally but personally. Black Sabbath wasn't just a job, it had been the place where his broken childhood and chaotic energy had found meaning. Losing it was like losing a piece of himself, yet, as history would prove, this was not the end but a turning point. The same energy that had driven him from Aston streets to global stages would fuel a reinvention that no one, not even Ozzy himself, could have predicted. But before that could happen, he had to fall, hard. the fall after Sabbath and the birth of the Blizzard of Oz era. When Ozzy Osbourne was fired from Black Sabbath in 1979, it wasn't just the loss of a job, it felt like the loss of his entire identity. For over a decade, Sabbath had been his home, the one place where chaos became power. Now, without warning or direct confrontation, that was gone. "That was my band," Ozzy later said. "It wasn't just music, it was my life." The days that followed were some of the darkest he would ever face. He retreated to a hotel room in Los Angeles, pulling the curtains shut and disappearing into a haze of drugs and alcohol. He wasn't eating regularly, wasn't answering calls, and spent long stretches in silence. It seemed entirely possible that this was where the Ozzy Osbourne story would end, alone, forgotten, and drowning in self-destruction. But fate had other plans, and her name was Sharon Osbourne. The daughter of Sabbath's former manager, she knew Ozzy's talent was far from spent. Visiting him in that hotel room, she didn't offer pity, she offered a challenge. "You were the magic in that band," she told him. "You can do this without them." Her belief in him was a spark in the darkness. Sharon began putting together a new band for him, and that's when Randy Rhoads entered the picture. Just 22 years old, Randy was a disciplined, technically brilliant guitarist whose style was the perfect counterpoint to Ozzy's raw, unpolished power. From their first rehearsal, there was an unspoken connection. Ozzy often said meeting Randy was like being given a second chance at life. They wasted no time getting to work. By 1980, they had recorded Blizzard of Oz, an album that would redefine Ozzy's career. Tracks like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley weren't just heavy, they were melodic, theatrical, and full of life. The record wasn't the sound of someone clinging to past glory, it was the sound of an artist reborn. The success was immediate. Blizzard of Oz went multi-platinum, and the follow-up, Diary of a Madman, released in 1981, proved it wasn't a fluke. On stage, Ozzy was revitalized. He leapt, he screamed, he poured himself into every performance. Offstage, he credited Randy with keeping him focused and pushing him forward. "Randy wasn't just a guitar player," Ozzy said. "He was my friend, my little brother, and the only reason I didn't give up." But as with so many high points in Ozzy's life, tragedy wasn't far away. In March 1982, during a tour stop in Florida, Randy was killed in the infamous plane crash that Ozzy would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. The loss shattered him, but in the months that followed, he chose to keep going, not just for himself, but in Randy's honour. The early 1980s became a balancing act between creative triumph and personal turmoil. While the albums sold and the tours packed arenas, the shadows of addiction, grief, and the pressures of fame were never far behind. Yet despite the chaos, Ozzy had achieved something no one had expected after his firing from Sabbath. He had built an entirely new identity, one that didn't just survive outside the band, but thrived. This era set the tone for the rest of his career. It proved that he could rise from the ashes, rebuild, and make music that connected with fans on a level that went beyond trends or genre. And in many ways, it was this resilience, first shown in the Blizzard of Oz years, that would carry him through the injuries, illnesses, and final years still ahead. From that moment on, Ozzy Osbourne wasn't just the former singer of Black Sabbath, he was a legend in his own right, a survivor whose story, like his music, would echo long after the last note faded.